Tonight, we're going to take a slow, quiet journey back in time. We'll talk about something very real, very heavy, and often left out of the history books. This is the story of what life was like on a slave ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean. From the moment people were taken from their homes, to the days they spent locked below deck in darkness, to the long silence that followed these terrible voyages. This story is told gently, in simple words, so it can be remembered and not forgotten. So, before you get comfortable, subscribe to the channel and like the video and comment down where are you watching from and at what time. So just lay back, breathe slow, and listen. There's no rush. We'll walk through this history together, step by step, with honesty and care. It always started quietly. A village might be waking up just like any other morning. Birds chirping in the tall trees. The smoke from small fires drifting lazily through the air. Children playing near the water. Women preparing the morning meal. Men heading out to the fields or the forest, walking with tools slung over their shoulders. Life wasn't perfect, but it had a rhythm. People lived in close-knit communities. There were stories told at night. Songs sung during work. Rituals held to celebrate the seasons. And then, without warning, everything changed. Sometimes, the first sound was distant shouting. Other times, it was a single scream that cracked the morning open like thunder. People ran. Confusion spread. Some thought it might be wild animals, but what came crashing through the trees wasn't nature. It was armed men, sometimes strangers, sometimes people from nearby regions, even rival tribes. And they weren't there to trade or talk. They came with weapons, sometimes iron-tipped spears, sometimes European-made guns, and their goal was to take people. Not just a few. Dozens. Hundreds, if they could. Adults. Teenagers. Even children. Anyone who could walk and be controlled. These were raiding parties, often organized by local leaders working with or for European traders. In some cases, people were captured during wars between groups. In others, it was pure kidnapping. They might come at night, torching homes while people slept. Or they might lure people out with false promises. There were so many methods, but the result was always the same. Fear. Violence. Separation. Lives shattered in an instant. Imagine that moment. You're with your family. You think you're safe. You think you'll sleep in your own bed tonight. And then, suddenly, you're being dragged away. You don't know where your parents are. Your siblings are screaming. People are tied together with ropes or rough bindings. Some try to fight. Some succeed. Many don't. And the ones who are taken, they begin a journey they didn't choose. A journey that would take them far from everything they knew. The captors didn't stop to explain what was happening. They didn't care. The people being taken away were seen as property, not humans. No names, just bodies. No backstory, just value. The long walks began. Sometimes for days. Sometimes for weeks. Forced marches through unfamiliar terrain. Through forests and over hills. Across rivers and open plains. At every step, people looked back, hoping for a chance to run. A miracle. A change. But it didn't come. The chains tightened. The guards stayed close. Some captives were gagged to keep them from calling out. Others were beaten if they slowed down. It wasn't unusual for people to die along the way, from exhaustion, injury, or heartbreak. If someone collapsed, they were often left behind. Or worse. The goal was to get as many bodies to the coast as possible. To deliver them like cargo. That's how the captors thought. Like traders. Like transporters. Not like people dealing with people. And so the journey continued. Sometimes through jungle heat so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. Sometimes under an open sun so bright that every step felt like walking through fire. And always with the heavy weight of fear. Not just fear of pain, but fear of the unknown. Where were they being taken? Why? Would they ever see their homes again? Their families? Their languages and stories? Most didn't know the word slave. Not at first. That was not part of their life. Some communities knew of servitude or captivity after war, But nothing like this. Nothing like what waited ahead. What started with being torn from a village would soon become something worse, something darker and longer and harder than any of them could imagine. Along the way, captors might stop at temporary holding spots, places where they could rest, check numbers, regroup. People were counted, inspected, sometimes traded between different groups. It was all done quickly, with no concern for the people themselves. Just numbers. Just deals. Sometimes people were branded, marked with hot metal to show ownership or origin. That kind of pain stayed. It didn't heal. It didn't go away. It was meant to last. Many of the captives couldn't speak the same language. They had been taken from different regions, different tribes. Some had never even seen the sea before. Others were children, still learning about the world when it changed forever. Yet they shared the same fear, the same silence, the same ache that settled into their bones. Some people tried to comfort each other. A soft whisper in a familiar tongue. A prayer. A song. Others stayed quiet, looking inward. The pain was too sharp, too fresh. Eyes watched the road ahead, searching for answers that wouldn't come. Feet kept moving, step after step, toward a future that was becoming darker with every mile. The first part of their freedom had already been stolen, the part that allowed them to decide where to walk, when to stop, who to speak to. The second part, their connection to home, had been broken the moment they crossed the threshold of their village. And the third part, their very identity, would come under attack next, as they neared the coast. Because waiting there, near the edge of the continent, was the next phase in this long, painful journey. Not yet the ship. Not yet the ocean. But something that would leave a scar of its own. By the time the forced march ended, many of the captives were barely standing. Their feet were raw from walking, their bodies weakened by hunger, exhaustion, and fear. But the journey inland was just the beginning. Because when they reached the coast, when they saw the ocean for the first time, what awaited them was not rescue or release, but confinement. The holding areas. The waiting places. The last stop before the ships. These were not quiet places. And they weren't built with care or comfort in mind. They were pens, forts, stone enclosures, open-air cages, or wooden buildings with thick doors and iron bars. Some had roofs. Many didn't. Some were located within. Massive European-built fortresses that loomed over the coastline. Others were smaller compounds set back from the shore. But they all had one purpose: to hold human beings like inventory. To keep them in place until the slave ships arrived. Inside these holding areas, people were packed together. There was little room to move, barely enough to sit down in peace. Captives were often kept in chains, wrists bound together, ankles shackled, sometimes attached to the walls. The air was heavy. It smelled of human waste, blood, salt, sweat, and fear. People cried, whispered, sometimes wailed. But there was no one to listen. No one who cared. These forts were run by European traders, Portuguese, British, Dutch, Spanish, French, depending on the time and location. They worked in partnership with local powers, exchanging guns, rum, cloth, beads, or metal goods for people. The men who ran these forts kept records, just like a business. Numbers in ledgers. Inventories of bodies. Descriptions of age, gender, condition. Not names. Never names. Just details that helped assign a price. And outside the holding rooms, in the inner courtyards of the forts, sailors and soldiers waited. There was no silence. There was always movement. Always shouting. Traders arguing over deals. Guards yelling at captives. Sometimes laughter. But not the kind of laughter that comes from joy. The kind that comes from power. The kind that echoes down stone corridors and makes your skin crawl. Days turned into weeks in these places. Some people were held for just a few days before a ship docked. Others were held for months. It depended on weather, shipping schedules, demand. During this time, people were inspected again and again. Traders checked their teeth, their muscles, their wounds. They looked for signs of disease, injury, or defiance. Anyone who seemed too sick, too weak, or too damaged might be left behind or killed. There was no dignity in these decisions. Just calculation. Food was minimal, a handful of something starchy, maybe millet or cassava, once or twice a day. Water came from barrels, and it was often warm or dirty. There were no real toilets. Just corners. Buckets. Sometimes nothing at all. And the smell of that neglect filled every room, clung to every wall. Some people tried to escape from these holding areas. A few succeeded, running into the forest or vanishing into the night. But most were caught. And when they were, the punishments were brutal. Public beatings. Executions. Long stretches in tighter, darker cells. These acts were meant not only to punish but to warn others. To kill hope before it could spread. And even among those who didn't try to flee, hope was fading. People began to feel the weight of despair. The isolation. The silence between their thoughts. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know what was coming. They just knew it was worse. The ocean stretched out in front of them like a blue void, and they had no idea what lay beyond it. Sometimes, ships would appear on the horizon, just silhouettes at first. The captives didn't know whether to fear them or long for them, but most feared them. Word had spread, even in whispers, about what those ships were. What they meant. People had seen others taken before and never returned. Stories passed from one person to another, even across language barriers, even with gestures alone. The ships were not a way home. They were a way deeper into darkness. Guards might shout when a ship got closer. Traders rushed to get paperwork in order. There was movement, urgency, energy. And in the holding pens, the fear shifted. People began to realize the moment was coming. The next step. The next descent. Some people wept. Others stared straight ahead. Some prayed. Some went quiet inside, turning off their thoughts so they wouldn't have to feel what was coming. The waiting was the worst part, some said. The silence between being taken and being shipped away. Because during that time, you still had your memories. You could still picture your village, your river, your mother's voice. You could still smell the food you once ate. Hear the laughter of your neighbors. You could still feel, in your heart, the place you belonged. That space was shrinking by the day. And eventually, the ships would dock. The planks would be lowered. The crew would come ashore. The captives would be lined up, counted again, sometimes washed or oiled to make them look healthier. Traders gave orders. Deals were finalized. The men from the ship might inspect the captives again, just like livestock. And then the orders came. It was time. The holding pens opened. The guards pushed people forward. Chains clanked. Feet shuffled. Some people collapsed. Others screamed. But the journey was already moving again. The next door had opened. And it led down to the shore. And waiting there was the ship. On the horizon, the sight of the transatlantic slave ships was a chilling signal of what was to come. These large, heavily armed vessels, sometimes carrying hundreds of sailors, cut through the water with an air of ominous purpose. For the captives held in the coastal forts and pens, the arrival of these ships was the moment when hope for freedom, however faint, was extinguished entirely. The ships were not there to rescue or help, but to claim human lives as mere property. The slave ships would often appear as dark, looming silhouettes against the backdrop of the bright blue ocean and sky. Their tall masts and billowing sails announced their approach long before they reached the shore. The sound of their cannons firing, a warning to any potential resistance, echoed through the air, reinforcing the sense of dread. Guards stationed in the forts would alert traders and captives alike, ordering the captives to prepare for the next step, boarding the ships. The crews of these ships were typically made up of sailors experienced in the dangerous journey ahead, along with soldiers or overseers responsible for maintaining order among the captives. The ships were heavily armed with cannons and muskets, ready to repel any attempt at rescue or rebellion, either from the captives or from outside forces. As the ships neared the shore, longboats or smaller vessels were often launched to ferry the crew and goods between the ship and land. These smaller boats also played a grim role in transporting the captives from the coastal forts down to the ship's waiting hold. The process was swift and brutal. Captives were forced into line, shackled, and driven forward with little regard for their exhaustion or injuries. The sound of chains rattling and people crying out in fear or pain filled the air. Sometimes captives were blindfolded or hooded to disorient them and reduce panic, though many were already too terrified to resist. The captains and traders wanted to avoid unrest at this stage. A revolt on shore could disrupt the entire operation and cost them money. Still, desperation occasionally erupted into violence, with guards resorting to whips or firearms to suppress resistance. Once at the water's edge, captives were loaded onto the smaller boats in groups. Some were too weak or sick to stand, and were carried or dragged. The boats rocked on the waves, cramped and unsafe, before making the short journey to the slave ship anchored offshore. The captives were often soaked by salt spray, their bodies chilled and trembling as they prepared for the next phase of their ordeal. Upon reaching the ship, captives faced the daunting sight of the vessel's high sides and narrow entry points. The gangplanks or ladders leading up to the deck were steep and difficult for many to climb, especially in chains and weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Crew members forced the captives upward, sometimes pushing and beating those who faltered. Women and children were sometimes separated from men at this stage, though the degree of segregation varied by ship and captain. The arrival of the slave ship marked a terrifying transition from confinement on land to the horrors of life below deck. The captives were now part of the ship's cargo, to be transported across the vast, unpredictable ocean. For the crew, this was a business venture. For the captives, it was the beginning of a journey into an unimaginable nightmare. Once aboard, captives were usually brought to the lower decks quickly to avoid drawing attention and to minimize the chance of unrest. The deck itself was a busy and noisy place, filled with sailors preparing the ship for departure, loading supplies, and securing the vessel against the elements. The contrast between the relative freedom of the deck and the oppressive conditions below was stark. At this moment, captives might catch glimpses of the vast, endless sea surrounding them, the sky stretching out endlessly above. But such sights did little to comfort. Instead, they were reminders of isolation, cut off from home, from everything they once knew, and now trapped on a moving prison with no escape. The captain and officers oversaw the boarding process with cold precision. Every person was accounted for, and preparations began to secure them below deck. The ship's crew worked swiftly to chain captives together and arrange them in their confined spaces. The arrival of the slave ship was the gateway to a cruel, dehumanizing journey where individual identities were stripped away, replaced by a grim tally of human cargo. For those waiting on the shore, the departure of the ship was a haunting image, a vessel carrying hundreds of stolen lives away from their homeland, disappearing into the vast Atlantic, with no certainty of ever seeing their land or families again. The arrival of the ship was the start of the Middle Passage, a journey that would test the limits of human endurance and suffering. Forced boarding was not just a physical act, it was a deeply traumatic event that marked the beginning of the most brutal chapter in the lives of the captured. Once the slave ship had anchored offshore and the small transport boats began to carry people from the forts to the ship, the procedure was precise, fast, and ruthless. Time was money, and every moment the ship remained docked or within sight of land posed a risk of escape, attack, or disease. The captives, often chained at the ankles or wrists in pairs or small groups, were herded toward the waterline by armed guards. The journey from the holding pens to the edge of the sea was loud and disorienting, filled with shouts, the clanking of iron chains, and the low cries of the terrified and exhausted captives. Some had already spent days or even weeks in coastal confinement, suffering from illness, injuries, and hunger. Now, they were being rushed forward, their final connection to land being stripped away. The march toward the boats was sometimes uphill or over rocky, uneven ground. Many captives stumbled or collapsed under the weight of the iron shackles and the heat of the sun. Those who could not walk were dragged, and those who resisted were beaten with sticks, leather whips, or gun butts. Screams and sobbing could often be heard, but they were ignored or silenced. Once at the shoreline, the captives were loaded into smaller boats, often packed so tightly that there was no room to move. The waves rocked these little crafts roughly, causing many to vomit from fear and seasickness. For some, the sight of the massive ship ahead, its sails full, its hull looming tall above the sea, triggered a wave of panic. Some tried to jump overboard in a final desperate attempt to flee. A few succeeded in throwing themselves into the water, but most were caught, shot, or drowned in the attempt. These moments of resistance were brief and always ended in greater suffering. When the boats reached the side of the slave ship, Crew members stationed on the deck would lower ladders, ropes, or crude boarding planks down the side of the vessel. The captives, still bound, were forced to climb aboard. This part was especially difficult. Climbing with iron shackles on weak legs, often after days or weeks of malnourishment and emotional trauma, meant many captives fell or had to be hoisted up by ropes like heavy bundles. Any delay in climbing or signs of refusal were punished immediately. At the top of the ladder, each person was met by sailors or guards who examined them quickly, checking for visible signs of disease or injury. Some captains rejected individuals who looked too sick to survive the voyage or fetch a good price. These unfortunates were sometimes left behind on shore to die or, worse still, thrown into the sea. For those who passed this brief inspection, their names, if known, were not recorded. Instead, they were often assigned a number, and from that point forward, they were treated entirely as cargo. Once on deck, there was little time to rest or look around. The captives were quickly ushered, often shoved or struck, toward open hatches that led down into the lower holds of the ship. The air changed noticeably near the openings. It was hot and thick, and already full of foul smells even before the ship left the shore. Those descending the narrow steps into the lower hold would have felt like they were entering a tomb. As captives were taken below, their eyes had to adjust quickly to the near darkness. The only light came from small slits or grated openings in the ship's sides, which did little to brighten the space. The ceilings were low, often forcing people to bend or crawl. The floor was wet and slick with filth. The air was stifling, already thick with the smell of human waste, salt, sweat, and fear. It was hard to breathe. Inside the hold, the captives were chained. Again, this time to the wooden platforms or directly to the ship's structure. Men were often placed in one section, women in another, and children elsewhere, though the degree of separation varied. In some cases, families were torn apart without a word. The chain gang system made it nearly impossible to move independently. People were arranged in tight rows, packed together with only a few inches of space between them. There was no bedding, no privacy, and no comfort. People lay directly on hard wood, on top of each other, their bodies becoming intertwined in the cramped space. The iron cuffs dug into their skin. The creaking of the ship, the groaning of the wooden beams, the distant crashing of waves, it all combined into a terrifying soundtrack that never ceased. Above deck, the crew continued boarding the rest of the captives. The process often lasted several hours, sometimes all day. Each new group was brought aboard and forced down into the already crowded hold. As more bodies were crammed in, the space became nearly uninhabitable. The captains had precise calculations for how many people could be fitted into a certain area, and they pushed those limits relentlessly. More people meant more profit. By the end of the boarding process, hundreds of captives would be trapped below, packed tighter than livestock, chained together in rows, unable to stand, sit fully upright, or even shift without disturbing the person next to them. The heat, darkness, and fear pressed down like a weight. People wept quietly or moaned from pain, while others fell into a silent, stunned state. For the crew, this was routine. They had done it before, and they would do it again. For the captives, it was a descent into a living hell from which there was no escape. The design of the transatlantic slave ships was deliberately calculated to turn human beings into cargo. Cargo that would be packed, restrained, and transported with maximum efficiency, regardless of comfort, dignity, or survival. These ships were not originally created for transporting people in such horrific ways, but they were modified over time to serve the cruel economic machinery of the slave trade. Shipbuilders and traders made changes, large and small, that reflected the cold logic of profit over human life. Slave ships were often medium-sized vessels, typically brigs or schooners, fast enough to outrun storms or pirates, yet large enough to carry hundreds of people across thousands of miles of ocean. The average ship might carry 200 to 400 enslaved individuals, but some ships carried even more. Their layout was not designed for balance or comfort, but for the ruthless goal of packing as many people as possible into the smallest possible space. From the outside, they looked like ordinary cargo ships, masts standing high, sails neatly tied, and hulls coated in tar to withstand long sea voyages. But inside, everything was different. The most critical part of the ship's layout was the slave deck, also called the between decks. This was a low-ceiling space built into the hull of the ship between the main deck and the cargo hold below. The height of this space was shockingly small, sometimes just 3 feet tall, not even enough for an adult to sit upright. The floor was wooden, often lined with rough planks, and it was usually damp and dirty, especially after the first day at sea. This is where the enslaved men were kept, laid side by side in tight rows with iron chains around their ankles or wrists, fixed to bolts in the floor or walls. These floor bolts were used to prevent movement, escape, or resistance. Sometimes, wooden platforms were added above or below the main floor to create layers, stacking human beings like boxes in a warehouse. Ventilation was a cruel joke on most slave ships. Small openings were cut into the sides of the ship, covered with bars or wooden slats, to let in a tiny bit of air. Some ships had wooden grates or hatches on the main deck that could be opened to provide light and airflow to the lower levels. But in stormy weather or when the ship was being pursued, these openings were closed, and the darkness became total. The air would grow hotter and more poisonous with every breath. Without proper ventilation, the heat, moisture, and stench became unbearable. People fainted, grew sick, or simply gave up. Some ships included small shelves built along the sides of the ship's interior, on which captives could be chained to make better use of vertical space. Others installed wooden bulkheads or partitions to divide the captives into separate groups, reducing the risk of coordinated rebellion. Every inch of usable space was filled, not with cargo in the traditional sense, but with breathing, thinking, suffering people. The storage areas for provisions were also modified. Ships needed to carry enough food, water, and supplies for the entire voyage, which could last 6 to 10 weeks, sometimes longer. Barrels of dried beans, rice, and water were stored in the deepest part of the hull, far below where the captives were kept. Ropes, chains, extra sails, weapons, and tools were stored in smaller compartments, often close to the crew's quarters or the captain's cabin. Above the slave deck, the main deck held the sailors' quarters, usually small and sparse. The crew slept in hammocks or on narrow bunks, sharing tight spaces with rats, insects, and the smell of the sea. The officers had slightly better quarters, still small, but with more privacy. The captain's cabin, usually located at the stern, was the largest and most secure room on the ship. It contained a table for navigation charts, a writing desk for the logbook, and sometimes a small bed or trunk for personal items. From this cabin, the captain issued orders, tracked the ship's course, and kept records, not of passengers, but of inventory. Weapon storage was a critical part of the ship's design. Slave ships often carried muskets, pistols, cutlasses, and chains, not just to fend off pirates or other ships, but to suppress any potential resistance from those on board. Cannons were rare on slave ships, as weight and space were precious, but some ships did have small swivel guns mounted on deck. Below deck, iron collars, thumb screws, and other restraints were kept ready in case any captives needed discipline. In addition to the physical layout, the structure of the ship reflected deep psychological control. The confined spaces, lack of natural light, and total control over the environment created a system of domination. The very walls of the ship were instruments of captivity. There were no windows to look out of, no landmarks to recognize, and no sound but that of the waves, the wind, the groans of the sick, and the creaking of timbers. The design of the slave ship was not accidental. Every decision, from the width of the floorboards to the placement of shackles, was made with the intention of stripping human beings of their autonomy. The ship became a floating prison, one that moved silently across the ocean while its passengers lay in darkness, heat, and fear. Even when the ship appeared calm from the outside, inside it was a machine of suffering, a system built to reduce people to property. The creak of the boards overhead, the endless sway of the waves, the clink of chains in the dark, these were the sounds of a ship whose layout was designed not for life, but for labor, money, and control. Below deck, the slave ship was like nothing most people could ever truly imagine unless they had been there. It wasn't just crowded. It was crushing. It wasn't just dark. It was absolute, consuming blackness for hours, sometimes days, at a time. And it wasn't just dirty. It was filled with the kind of filth, sickness, and smell that made your eyes water and your stomach twist. The human body wasn't meant to survive in a space like that for so long, and yet hundreds were forced into it together, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, for weeks at sea. The ceilings were so low in some areas that adults couldn't sit upright. Most had to lie down on their sides, often with their legs bent because there wasn't even room to stretch them out fully. People were packed in rows, lying so close together that they touched on all sides. There was no privacy, no personal space, no room to move, no chance to even roll over in your sleep. The floor was wooden and hard, sometimes slick with sea water or bodily fluids, and sometimes lined with mats or nothing at all. There was almost no light. Only small grates or tiny barred openings in the sides of the ship allowed the faintest glimmer of daylight through. But in many cases, those openings were closed or covered to prevent escape or to protect against storms, meaning complete darkness fell over the captives below deck. In the dark, people had to listen and feel more than see. Breathing grew louder, more labored. The groans of pain, the quiet crying, the sound of someone coughing, it was all louder in the dark. And in that dark, time stopped having any meaning. A minute could feel like an hour. A day could stretch endlessly. Everywhere you turned your senses were overwhelmed. The air was thick and wet. It felt heavy in your lungs. People were vomiting, coughing, moaning. The smell of blood, sweat, vomit, excrement, and urine mixed with the stench of infection and decay. It was a stew of human suffering. The stench alone could drive people to madness, and for the enslaved, there was no escape. Buckets were sometimes passed around to be used for waste, but there weren't enough, and not everyone could reach them. So waste collected where people lay. On the floor. On bodies. It soaked into clothing, into hair, into the skin itself. Sickness spread like wildfire. In such tight spaces with poor ventilation, all it took was one sick person and soon dozens were ill. Skin diseases were common. Boils, sores, rashes. Many developed respiratory infections from breathing in the damp, stale air day after day. Fevers came quickly and stayed for days. Dysentery, a sickness that caused constant diarrhea and dehydration, was one of the most deadly. It didn't just spread, it lingered. The weakened body of a sick person, stuck lying in their own waste, barely able to move, rarely had a chance to recover. And through it all, people tried to hold on. Some talked quietly when they could, sharing bits of comfort in their own languages, singing softly to one another, praying together in whispers. Others were silent, saving their energy, or retreating into their minds just to survive the next hour. Many couldn't speak, from fear, from exhaustion, or from being too ill to form words. Because of the layout of the ship, the heat was unbearable. With so many bodies packed tightly together and so little airflow, the temperature rose fast. On hotter days, the air became suffocating. People sweated constantly, even when still. Their skin stayed wet, sticky, and itchy. Parasites like lice and fleas spread easily, adding to the misery. People scratched until they bled. Wounds went untreated and became infected. The infections oozed, crusted over, and worsened. And still, no fresh air, no real light. Some enslaved people were kept in chains even below deck, wrists and ankles shackled to others or to iron bars or floor bolts. Movement was limited, and when they had to eat or relieve themselves, they often had to do it lying down, still chained. Food was passed to them where they lay, sometimes in handfuls, sometimes in small bowls, and always with the warning not to spill or waste a single bite. Clean water was given in tiny amounts, barely enough to soothe a dry throat, let alone quench thirst. It wasn't just the physical space that broke people. It was the silence from above. The world went on without them. The crew walked the deck, adjusted sails, barked orders, while below, the enslaved waited for food, for light, for anything to change. Some lost track of whether it was day or night. They couldn't see the sun or feel the wind. Sometimes the only clue that time had passed was the sound of sailors' boots above or the shift in the ship's motion. The constant rocking of the ship added another layer of torment. When the waves were calm, it was a slow, nauseating sway. When storms came, it was violent. People slid across the floor, slammed into each other, rolled over in puddles of waste or blood. With nowhere to brace themselves, the motion made sickness worse. The smell of vomit mixed with everything else. And when someone died, and it happened often, their body might stay there for hours before it was taken up. In some cases, the dead weren't even noticed right away in the dark and noise. People lay pressed against corpses, helpless to move away. The crew came down occasionally, not out of kindness, but to count, check chains, or hand out food. They carried lanterns, and the sudden light hurt people's eyes. They brought no comfort. Only commands, threats, and sometimes violence. If someone cried out too loudly or resisted, punishment was swift. So most stayed quiet, enduring, trying to survive. Some tried to remember home. Others tried to forget it. In all, the conditions below deck were not merely hard. They were a kind of torture. A slow grinding away of hope, health, and humanity. They were designed to reduce people into numbers, into items to be bought and sold. And yet, in the darkness, people still prayed. They still whispered names. They still breathed, even if only just. And that, too, was resistance. The smells on a slave ship were unlike anything found on land. They didn't just linger in the air, they filled every corner of the space below deck and clung to everything, from the wooden planks to the people themselves. There was no fresh air to dilute them. No windows to open. No breeze to carry them away. Instead, the air sat heavy and still, trapping every foul odor in place, growing stronger and more unbearable with every passing hour. It started with the smell of sweat. Hundreds of people, crammed into a tight space, with no room to move and no relief from the heat, produced a stifling, sour odor that soaked the air. Sweat poured from their bodies day and night, soaking into the floor, the walls, and their clothing. In the tropical heat or the sealed-up hull of the ship, the sweat never dried completely. It only mingled with other odors, thickening the atmosphere into something almost too dense to breathe. Then there was the smell of human waste. There were no toilets below deck. Just a few buckets, passed from hand to hand, not enough for everyone and often too far to reach. People who were shackled together had no way to get up. So they relieved themselves where they lay. Urine soaked the wooden floor. Feces spread under and between bodies. As the days went on, the floor became slick with filth. The waste dried in patches but was constantly refreshed by more, never truly gone, never cleaned. And the smell that came from it was sharp and pungent, attacking the nose with a force that made it hard to think, hard to breathe, hard to keep food down. But it didn't stop there. The smell of sickness joined in quickly. Dysentery, infections, fevers, all brought with them their own foul signatures. The rotting odor of untreated wounds filled the space. Skin diseases gave off a sour, sickly stench. Vomit added to the mix, often pooling on the floor or soaked into clothes. In some cases, it even stuck to people's hair or faces, dried in place when there was no water to clean themselves. The air was so full of these overlapping odors that it seemed to weigh down on the body like a second skin. Salt also hung in the air, but not the kind that brings freshness. This salt was from the sea, yes, but also from sweat, dried on skin, on chains, on the walls. It crusted over the bodies of the enslaved, mixing with grime to form a gritty layer. The smell of salt mingled with iron, the scent of blood, sometimes fresh from wounds, sometimes old from chafed wrists and ankles where the shackles rubbed the skin raw. Together, they created an odor that was metallic and bitter, lingering in the back of the throat. The wooden boards of the ship themselves absorbed all of this over time. Every inch of the hold carried the stench. Even if the space had been scrubbed, the smell was deep in the grain of the planks. And it wasn't scrubbed often. Only when someone died or before reaching land did a real attempt at cleaning happen, and even then, it was surface level. The smell stayed. Sailors, too, could smell it from above deck. Some wore scarves over their noses or kept to the windward side of the ship to avoid the worst of it. The air was damp, close, and warm. With no circulation, the smells didn't move or fade. They built up. Every breath taken below deck brought a fresh wave of stink. People gagged in their sleep. Some became used to it, not because the smell got better, but because their senses grew numb. Others could never adjust. Nausea was constant. It became normal to throw up, lie in it, and then go still again. Some captives wept because of the odor, because it was one more way their dignity had been taken, one more humiliation forced on them. Even after the voyage, the smell clung to survivors. People who disembarked carried it with them in their hair, their clothes, their skin. The ship itself reeked of it, long after the human cargo had been unloaded. It was a smell that didn't just describe a place. It described an experience. It described suffering, cruelty, decay. A smell that spoke of pain without words. And it was unforgettable. The clinking and clanking of chains was a constant sound aboard a slave ship. It echoed with every slight movement, every turn of a head, every shift of a limb. Metal against metal, metal against wood, metal against skin. Iron shackles were a core part of the slave ship, not just a restraint but a symbol of total control, total ownership. The enslaved were bound by them for nearly the entire journey, and the marks those shackles left, both physical and emotional, stayed long after the voyage was over. Each enslaved person was restrained soon after being brought aboard. There was no delay. The moment someone crossed the plank from land to ship, the iron was waiting. The shackles were cold and unforgiving. Heavy cuffs snapped shut around ankles, wrists, and sometimes even necks. Each cuff was locked in place, connected by short chains designed to limit movement. The iron was usually unpadded, rough-edged, and often rusted. No consideration was given to comfort or injury. These shackles were not meant for kindness, they were tools of control. Most enslaved people were shackled in pairs. Two people, strangers more often than not, bound together by the ankles. Every movement had to be negotiated. If one turned to sleep on their side, the other felt the pull. If one needed to shift or scratch or adjust, the other was dragged along with them. There was no freedom to move alone. There was no space for privacy. These bonds meant that even the smallest actions became awkward and slow. The chains clanked every time someone tried to find a new position or stretch their legs. Sleep was a luxury, and movement was a frustration. Wrists were also commonly bound, especially during times when the ship's crew feared resistance. Some captives were chained at the wrists for the entire voyage. Others had one wrist linked to an iron bar, to a plank, or to another person. In rare cases, neck collars were added, thick iron rings with a chain leading to the wall or floor. These were especially degrading. They made it nearly impossible to lie down properly and ensured that every shift pulled on the neck, causing strain, stiffness, and sometimes bruising or open wounds. The shackles weren't fitted with any care. They were made in bulk, often too tight or too loose. When too tight, they cut into the skin quickly. The pressure created deep bruises and often tore the skin within days. Infection set in fast, especially in the warm, dirty air of the lower deck. If the shackles were too loose, they rubbed. Constant friction created raw patches, and those patches bled. The skin broke open, and the sores were rarely treated. With bodies packed so tightly together and the presence of sweat, waste, and disease, small wounds from shackles often grew into serious injuries. Many enslaved people carried permanent marks from these restraints, deep scars on their ankles and wrists that never faded. For some, bone grew misshapen. For others, nerve damage made hands or feet go numb. The physical damage was brutal, but the psychological weight was just as heavy. Being shackled meant more than just physical bondage. It was a message every hour of the day. You're not free, you're not safe, you're not a person in their eyes. The iron was always there to remind them. The sound of the chains became a kind of background noise, a language of its own. Sometimes, it was frantic, the rattle of someone trying to move, trying to escape, trying to resist. Other times, it was slow and tired, the quiet clink of someone shifting in discomfort. For the crew, the sound was a sign that control was intact. For the enslaved, it was the soundtrack of their captivity, a constant noise that echoed their suffering. Even on the rare occasions when captives were brought above deck for air or cleaning, the shackles stayed on. Their steps were small and halting. They couldn't run. That was the point. They couldn't even walk quickly. The chains were both physical and psychological barriers. The weight of the iron was more than just pounds. It was the crushing force of power, of cruelty, of ownership. The enslaved weren't allowed to forget, not even for a second, that they were seen as cargo, not people. And when someone died, the shackles were often removed only after the body was taken away. In some cases, if both people in a pair had died, the chains were unlocked together. But in others, the dead remained chained to the living for hours or even days, their weight adding to the burden, their presence an unrelenting reminder of what could come next. The iron didn't care. It held the living and the dead with equal indifference. Shackles didn't just restrain, they dehumanized. They turned people into objects. They created silence, submission, stillness. But within that silence, a different kind of resistance sometimes stirred, a quiet strength, a refusal to give up even when every link of the chain tried to say otherwise. The iron could hold the body, but not always the spirit. Disease was one of the most relentless killers aboard a slave ship. With so many bodies pressed together, so little air, and such filthy, wet conditions, it didn't take long for sickness to spread from one person to the next like a wave, passing through the lower deck without warning and without mercy. Sometimes it would start with one person, a cough, a fever, or a bout of vomiting, and by the time the crew noticed, a dozen others were already showing symptoms. The illnesses didn't stop once they began. They kept going, wearing people down slowly or snatching them away fast. The most common and feared disease was dysentery. On land, it was already dangerous, but on a ship like this, it was a death sentence for many. It caused painful, constant diarrhea, often bloody, which led quickly to dehydration. When someone was already weak, starved, shackled, and unable to move freely, the loss of water and nutrients from their body could mean the end within days. There were no real medicines on board to treat it. No special care, no privacy. People with dysentery lay in their own waste, fouling the floor and the air, and infecting the people beside them. The next most common illness was what many called the flux, another name for a violent digestive illness that left people weak, disoriented, and covered in filth. Some had high fevers. Others hallucinated. In the dim light of the hold, these symptoms often looked like madness. People raved or moaned, sometimes screaming without control, burning with fever one moment and shivering the next. They weren't given space to rest. They weren't separated from the healthy. The sick lay beside the well, coughing and vomiting into shared air, contaminating everything around them. Skin infections were everywhere. With no way to wash properly and no clean clothes or bedding, skin diseases thrived. Open sores developed where shackles rubbed raw. Fungus grew between toes and fingers. Scabies spread from person to person, tiny mites that burrowed under the skin and caused unbearable itching. People scratched until they bled, and the bleeding turned into infection. Some developed large boils, angry and full of pus. Others had rashes from head to toe. These conditions weren't isolated, almost everyone had something. And the scratching, the bleeding, the constant pain from skin disease added another layer of suffering to the already unbearable voyage. Respiratory illnesses were also common. The air below deck was thick, stale, and damp, the perfect environment for bacteria and viruses to thrive. Coughs turned into chest infections. Many suffered from bronchitis or pneumonia. There was no place to lie flat and rest. No way to clear the lungs. A simple cough became a deep, wet hack that rattled through the bones and echoed in the hull. The sound of people coughing, deep, raw, endless, was part of the daily soundtrack of the slave ship. Fevers took hold of many, especially those suffering from malaria or typhoid. Some burned with heat, drenched in sweat and too weak to move. Others fell into confused states, whispering to themselves or seeing things that weren't there. Delirium was common. Some captives whispered to the darkness. Others called out for home, for their families, for water. The crew avoided them, afraid of catching whatever had taken hold. And yet, they didn't try to isolate the sick, they just left them where they lay. Smallpox was another danger. If even one person boarded with it, the entire ship could suffer an outbreak. Smallpox brought painful blisters, high fever, and, often, death. Survivors were left with deep scars on their faces and bodies. If the disease broke out, there was panic among the crew. In some cases, infected captives were thrown overboard, not out of cruelty alone, but fear. The disease terrified sailors, who knew just how quickly it could spread. Even among the crew, illness was common. They, too, were not immune to the foul conditions, though they suffered less than the enslaved below deck. Some of the enslaved tried to care for each other. A mother might wipe the brow of a child burning with fever. An older man might whisper prayers or comforting words to someone sick beside him. But there were no tools. No medicine. No supplies. Nothing but the strength of the human spirit trying to resist the collapse of the body. When someone died from disease, they were taken above deck and thrown into the sea. Sometimes this happened quietly in the night. Other times, it was a hurried task carried out by crew members eager to remove the body and avoid further infection. But by the time one body was removed, another person had already fallen ill. The cycle didn't stop. It went on for the entire voyage. Disease on a slave ship was not just a threat. It was a constant reality. It floated in the air, clung to the skin, soaked into the boards, and spread through every breath and every touch. There was no escape from it. The ship itself became a kind of moving plague, a slow, painful journey in which survival was uncertain and sickness was almost guaranteed. The food given to enslaved people during the transatlantic voyage was not truly food in the way we might think of it today. It wasn't intended to nourish or to comfort. It wasn't prepared with care or served with respect. It was, more than anything, a survival measure, barely enough to keep a person alive, and never enough to help them recover strength or health. The meals were rationed, not just in quantity but in purpose. The ship owners and captains wanted the enslaved people to survive just long enough to reach the other side of the ocean, because every death meant a financial loss. But they didn't want to spend more on food than they had to. Twice a day, someone from the crew would bring around buckets or small pots of what was often called slop or mush. This was usually a kind of boiled grain, cornmeal, millet, or sometimes rice, that had been cooked in large iron pots over open fires on deck. There were no spices, no oil, no meat, no vegetables. Sometimes it was just grain boiled in water until it turned soft and thick. At other times, it might be mixed with bits of spoiled salted meat or beans that had begun to rot. The goal was to fill the stomach with something heavy enough to prevent collapse, not to make it palatable. The food would be handed out in rough metal or wooden bowls, sometimes passed from person to person. But the enslaved people, often chained in tight rows, could barely move to eat. Many had to eat lying down, using one hand to scoop the mush into their mouths while their ankles or wrists remained shackled. Some couldn't reach the food at all and had to rely on the mercy of someone nearby to feed them. Others, too weak from illness or injury, simply lay there and stared at the bowl, unable to eat, even if they wanted to. Spoilage was common. The grain often had insects in it, weevils crawling through the meal, beetles in the rice. The salted meat, when it was available, might be rancid from the heat and moisture of the hold. The crew didn't discard spoiled food. If it was still solid, it was fed to the captives. People gagged as they chewed, but hunger forced them to swallow. Vomiting was common. And if someone vomited up their food, they weren't given more. That was considered waste. The logic was cruel and simple. If you couldn't keep it down, you didn't need it. Water was worse. Stored in large wooden barrels, the water was often stagnant by the second or third week of the voyage. In the heat of the ship, the water would take on a bitter, sour taste. Algae sometimes grew in it. It smelled of wood rot, mold, and salt. The crew got the better water, drawn from cleaner barrels or rationed for officers. The enslaved were given what was left. It was distributed in cups or ladled into mouths. Some of the people, weak and unable to sit up, had water poured between their lips by others, or by a hurried crewman. The quantity of food and water was never enough. People were always hungry, always thirsty. Their bodies shrank from the lack of nutrients. Bellies swelled with hunger, and ribs became visible. Skin hung loose over bones. Hair fell out. Gums bled. Some went blind or developed sores from vitamin deficiencies. Others fainted without warning. The children, in particular, suffered greatly. Their smaller bodies couldn't withstand the starvation. Their cries were often weak, sometimes fading into silence over the course of a few days. Mealtimes were not quiet or gentle affairs. There was noise, crying, pleading, the clatter of bowls, the sound of shackles clinking as people shifted. Some captives argued over food, especially if a serving had been spilled. Fights would break out, not out of malice, but desperation. Crew members sometimes beat those who tried to take more than their share. And if someone refused to eat, either out of sickness or protest, they were forced to. Crewmen used metal rods or wooden sticks to pry mouths open. Food would be shoved in. Water would be poured down the throat. Resistance was not tolerated. These feeding routines were driven by a cold system of numbers. The ship's crew didn't see people when they looked at the captives. They saw inventory. Every life had a price. And the less they spent on keeping those lives alive, the more profit they could make on the other side. So, they fed the captives just enough to keep them moving, just enough to keep their hearts beating, but never enough to help them heal or grow strong again. There were rare moments when a slightly better meal was offered, perhaps on the day before reaching port, when traders wanted the captives to appear healthier to increase the sale price. A bit of dried fruit. A handful of beans that weren't completely rotten. A swallow of cleaner water. But these were calculated offerings, not kindness. They were designed to increase profit, not reduce suffering. Over time, the daily pattern of meager meals and bitter water became part of the rhythm of the voyage. People learned to wait, to force themselves to eat even when their stomachs turned, to swallow sour water and hope it wouldn't make them sick. There was no comfort in it. Only survival. And even that was never guaranteed. There was something strange and deeply unsettling about how time slipped away on a slave ship. The days didn't feel like days at all. There were no clocks to mark the passing hours, no sunrises to greet the morning or sunsets to close the evening, at least not for the enslaved people kept below deck. Down in the darkness, where lanterns barely glowed and the air was always thick and hard to breathe, time became a vague, slow, almost cruel kind of fog. Moments blended into one another until it felt like everything was happening at once, and nothing at all. There were no windows in the hold. Just thick wooden walls and heavy beams above their heads. The light from the outside world barely touched them. Maybe a thin shaft of daylight slipped in when the hatch opened briefly, or when someone was dragged up to the deck. But for the most part, the people below lived in shadow. Days passed without any clear sign that the sun had risen or set. People tried to guess what time it might be, but guessing soon gave way to forgetting. Was it morning now? Or night? Had they been on the ship for 3 days? 10? A month? It became harder and harder to hold on to any sense of how long they'd been out there on the ocean. The sameness of each day only made things worse. Every sound, every smell, every task was a repeat of the last. The food came at the same time, if there was food at all. The same watery mush, the same sour water. The crew stomped across the deck above them in the same angry rhythm. The chains clinked in the same way when someone shifted or cried out. The stench of sweat, vomit, and waste never changed. The days didn't build toward anything. They just stretched on, long and slow, like one unbroken moment of suffering. Some people tried to count the days. They scratched at the wooden floor with a fingernail or used a pebble to make marks. But after a while, they'd lose track. Someone might bump into their marks. Or the floor might be cleaned and wiped down. Or they'd simply forget if they had counted that day yet. The brain, starved of sleep and overwhelmed by fear, didn't hold memories the same way anymore. Everything blurred together. Others tried to measure time by the routines of the ship. When the food came, they knew another part of the day had passed. When they were dragged up to the deck to wash themselves or breathe the air, rare as that was, it marked another cycle. But these events were irregular, sometimes skipped or delayed, depending on the weather or the mood of the crew. The routines offered no true rhythm. They came and went without warning. And so even that weak sense of time started to slip away. Sleep didn't help. There was no clear distinction between night and day, between waking and resting. People slept in short, broken intervals, sometimes in shifts, sometimes all at once. But the space was so cramped, the air so poor, and the noise so constant that deep sleep was nearly impossible. Bodies twisted and turned, shackled together, trying to find a position that would allow even a few minutes of rest. The darkness was always there, and it made it feel like sleep never truly ended, just faded into a new form of waking misery. The human mind is not made to exist without time, without something to look forward to, without change. And so, in that strange, hollow environment, many people began to withdraw inward. Some stopped speaking entirely. They stared at the wooden beams above or closed their eyes for hours at a time. They forgot what day it was, forgot where they had come from. Their old lives, their names, the faces of their family, it all started to drift, as if those memories belonged to someone else, far away. Others whispered to one another, shared stories in hushed voices, tried to create some sort of rhythm, counting, praying, humming. Just something to hold on to, something to remind them that they were still alive. That time still moved, even if it couldn't be seen. These small acts of humanity were quiet rebellions against the ship's endless sameness. Sometimes, the crew would enter the hold and throw everything into chaos. Someone would be punished. A fight would break out. A person would die. Those moments brought terror, but they also reminded the captives that time hadn't frozen completely. Something had changed, even if it was horrible. In a way, it was proof that the world outside still existed. But once the storm passed, things settled back into the same rhythm again. The same air, the same chains, the same unknown, unmeasurable length of time. Eventually, most people stopped trying to count the days. They stopped wondering how long they had been at sea. They stopped thinking about when the voyage might end. It hurt too much to hope. It hurt too much to wait. Instead, they focused on surviving the next hour, the next minute, taking the next breath, holding on until something changed, until a crewman opened the hatch, or the ship rocked differently, or someone next to them moved. That was how time worked on a slave ship. It didn't tick forward, like a clock. It stretched, like a rope pulled tight. Sometimes it felt endless. Sometimes it snapped. Punishment aboard the slave ships was harsh, immediate, and meant to send a message. Any attempt by the enslaved to resist their captivity, whether that resistance was loud and open, or quiet and subtle, was met with swift and often brutal violence. The crew didn't just punish to restore control. They punished to destroy hope, to strip away any belief that rebellion might succeed. Their methods were not random or improvised. They were planned and systematic. Fear was used as a tool, and cruelty was sharpened into something cold and routine. Resistance could take many forms. Sometimes, it was an outright refusal to eat. An enslaved person might turn their face away from the bowl, clamp their lips shut, and try to starve themselves rather than endure the suffering any longer. In the eyes of the crew, this act of self-control was defiance. It threatened the cargo's value, and so it had to be stopped. Sailors would pry open mouths with metal tools or force feed through tubes made of tin or wood. If that didn't work, beatings followed, lashes across the back, arms, or legs until the person gave in or collapsed. There were also those who tried to break free of their shackles. In rare moments, someone might manage to slip out of their chains or unlock a cuff with something sharp or narrow. If discovered, they were beaten mercilessly. Shackles would be fastened even tighter. Sometimes, their ankles or wrists would be deliberately broken to prevent further attempts. Other times, iron collars or extra bindings would be added, ensuring they couldn't move without severe pain. Verbal resistance, pleading, shouting, praying too loudly, could provoke punishment just as much as physical defiance. The crew didn't want noise. They didn't want protest. They wanted silence, obedience, and stillness. If someone spoke out, even if it was only to comfort a fellow captive, it could be seen as a threat. A lash, a kick, a boot to the ribs. These were the answers they received. And when one person was punished, the others watched. That was the point. Sometimes, resistance took a quieter, more organized shape. Whispers passed between rows. Plans began to form, about overpowering the crew, about seizing weapons, about taking the ship. These plans were rare, but not unheard of. The enslaved were not ignorant. Many came from warrior cultures. Some had been leaders or fighters before capture. They understood tactics. They knew about strength in numbers. And so, once in a while, they would try. If such a rebellion was discovered before it began, the punishments were preemptive and public. A few would be chosen at random, whether or not they were involved, and hauled up to the deck. There, in front of everyone, they were tortured, beaten, sometimes mutilated, sometimes killed. Their bodies would be displayed, or their screams left to echo below deck. The message was clear: this is what happens when you rise up. If the rebellion actually took place, the outcome depended on how quickly the crew responded. Some revolts resulted in brief moments of hope, captives taking the deck, killing sailors, even turning the ship back for a short time. But the crew was usually armed, and often outnumbered the captives on deck. Once the revolt was crushed, the retribution was fierce. Whippings turned into executions. Bodies were tossed overboard. Shackles were tightened. Rations were reduced. The survivors paid the price not only for their own actions but for the threat they had posed to the system itself. The tools of punishment were many: whips made of rope or leather, often tipped with metal or bone. Clubs, made from wood or iron. Shackles that rubbed raw against the skin. Some punishments were designed to humiliate as much as hurt. People might be stripped and forced to stand or crawl in positions of extreme discomfort. They might be chained in isolation, or burned, or denied food and water for days. What made it worse was that even those who didn't resist could be punished. If someone moved too slowly, if they cried too loudly, if they vomited in the wrong place, any of these things could be labeled as disobedience. The rules were always shifting, often arbitrary, always enforced with cruelty. It created a climate where no one felt safe. No one knew what might trigger violence next. And yet, in spite of the punishments, resistance never fully disappeared. It existed in tiny acts of defiance, a refusal to speak the captor's language, a song hummed quietly in a forbidden tongue, a look of determination that remained, even after the beatings. The enslaved were not broken as easily as the crew might have hoped. They endured. They remembered who they were, even when everything else was taken. Still, the punishments cast a long shadow over every moment of the voyage. They were the ever-present threat that kept most captives quiet. Most heads bowed. Most hands still. Resistance was brave, but it came at a terrible cost. And the ship itself became a floating warning, a place where pain was constant, and where even a flicker of rebellion could be swallowed by the sea. Life aboard a slave ship was brutal for everyone on board, not just for the enslaved people locked below deck, but also for the crew tasked with keeping the vessel moving across the ocean. While the conditions faced by the crew were nothing compared to the suffering of the enslaved, the daily life of a sailor on a slave ship was still filled with hardship, discomfort, and danger. These men were often poor, desperate, and working in one of the most morally dark corners of the maritime world. Many were drawn in by promises of payment, adventure, or simply survival, but few found the voyage easy. The cruise day typically began at sunrise, but time on a ship wasn't tracked the same way as it was on land. The day was broken into watches, which were rotating shifts that kept the ship running around the clock. Most of the crew worked in shifts of 4 hours on, followed by 4 hours off. There was no such thing as a weekend, and no holidays. The ocean didn't stop moving, and the ship didn't stop needing hands to manage it. Sailors were responsible for a wide range of tasks, many of them physically demanding and dangerous. They trimmed and repaired sails, adjusted rigging, scrubbed the decks, cleaned the ship's hull, and kept the pumps running to remove seawater from the lower levels. They also took turns keeping lookout, steering the ship, and assisting the officers. When storms came, they worked non-stop in the wind and rain, risking their lives to keep the ship from capsizing. Injuries were common: broken fingers, crushed limbs, concussions from swinging booms, and medical help was minimal. In addition to the physical labor, the crew had another, far more disturbing duty: managing and guarding the enslaved people below deck. This meant distributing food and water, monitoring for signs of rebellion, and enforcing the rules with violence when necessary. Some sailors were brutal, relishing the authority they had over people in chains. Others were quiet and withdrawn, haunted by the cries they heard in the dark. A few drank heavily or took drugs to numb themselves. But all of them were caught in a system that demanded their participation, one way or another. Meals for the crew were basic and repetitive. Salted meat, hardtack, a dry, almost rock-hard biscuit, and peas or beans made up the bulk of their diet. Fresh water was stored in barrels and often grew stale or algae-covered over time. When it rained, they might collect cleaner water, but in dry spells, they had to ration what they had. Sometimes, food spoiled or ran out, and they'd be left with almost nothing until they reached port. There were no fresh fruits or vegetables, so scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a constant threat. Sleep was irregular and often uncomfortable. Sailors slept in hammocks or on bare wooden boards below deck. The space was cramped, loud, and hot. They had to sleep in shifts, and sleep was easily interrupted by storms, emergencies, or cries from the enslaved. Rats and cockroaches were everywhere, crawling through bedding and chewing through supplies. The smell of the ship, salt, sweat, vomit, blood, decay, permeated everything, including the sailors' clothes and skin. Cleanliness was a challenge. Sailors didn't bathe regularly, and fresh water was too valuable to waste on washing. Clothes were rarely changed, and infections were common. Cuts could turn septic, teeth rotted in mouths, and lice and fleas were nearly impossible to get rid of. Skin diseases and foot infections, caused by standing barefoot or in damp shoes, were almost expected. Despite all this, discipline among the crew was strict. Officers kept detailed logs of behavior and could administer punishment for laziness, theft, drunkenness, or insubordination. A sailor might be flogged in front of his peers, locked in irons, or denied rations as a warning to others. The captain held the final say on any disciplinary matters, and some captains ruled with an iron fist. Others let their officers handle problems, keeping themselves at a distance from the day-to-day suffering. Still, a strange sense of hierarchy and order existed on board. Everyone had a role, from the cook to the carpenter, the sailmaker to the cooper who repaired barrels. There were chain-of-command structures, routines, and spoken rules about how things worked. In this floating world of violence and misery, structure was the one thing keeping the ship functioning and afloat. Some sailors tried to find moments of escape or distraction. They told stories, sang sea shanties, or carved patterns into bits of wood. They played simple games using dice or cards made from scraps. They wrote letters they couldn't send or scratched journal entries into the margins of books. These small acts helped them hold on to their sense of humanity, even as they were part of something deeply inhumane. But even in moments of rest, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The threat of revolt, the groans from the deck below, the constant rocking of the ship, the ever-changing weather, all of it kept nerves on edge. Some crew members formed uneasy bonds, leaning on each other for strength. Others turned cold and solitary, trusting no one. There was no single way to endure the voyage. When the ship lost enslaved people to disease, death, or suicide, the crew sometimes had to throw bodies overboard. This was part of their job too, and over time, many became numb to it. Death became as common as wind or waves. Life became a routine of survival, labor, and following orders, whether or not those orders turned the stomach or scarred the soul. And when the ship finally reached its destination, some sailors disembarked and never returned to the sea. Others signed on again, too poor or desperate to turn down the pay. The pay wasn't even generous. It might take months for sailors to see their wages, and many were cheated out of them. But for men with nowhere else to go, even the horrors of a slave ship were better than hunger on land. So the daily life of the crew was filled with labor, filth, danger, and moral weight. They were not enslaved, but they were far from free. They were cogs in a deadly machine, turning the gears of an economy built on human suffering. And though their hardships were real, they were also part of the system that inflicted far greater pain below the deck, where people lived not as sailors, but as cargo. The captain of a slave ship held a position of absolute authority and immense responsibility throughout the voyage. Though he was often physically isolated from both the crew and the enslaved people below deck, his role was central to every decision made on board, from navigation and discipline to the management of human cargo and the calculation of profits. The captain was the ultimate figure of power on the ship, and everything that happened, from the moment of departure until arrival, reflected his leadership, for better or worse. Unlike the crew who worked continuously to keep the ship operational, the captain generally kept himself apart, often residing in the quarterdeck cabin at the stern. This space was more private, shielded from the dirt, noise, and chaos that consumed the lower decks. Here, he could plan the route, study maps, and monitor the ship's progress without constant interruption. Still, his duties were demanding and unrelenting. From the outset, the captain was responsible for assembling his crew, preparing the ship, and ensuring it was stocked with provisions, weapons, and shackles. He coordinated with the traders and investors financing the voyage, setting goals for profit margins and timelines. While the crew carried out the physical tasks, The captain orchestrated the larger picture, managing the logistics of an operation designed to transport hundreds of human beings across a vast ocean. One of the most crucial responsibilities of the captain was maintaining strict discipline. He issued orders to officers and crew, giving instructions on navigation, watch rotations, and how to handle the enslaved people. His word was law, and disobedience was often met with harsh punishment. The captain's authority extended to meting out or sanctioning violence, whether to quell rebellion among the captives or to control insubordination within the crew. The captain was also the keeper of records. He maintained detailed logs or journals documenting every aspect of the voyage. These ship logs recorded the dates of departure and arrival, the weather encountered, routes taken, and notable events, such as storms or illnesses. But beyond these navigational notes, the captain meticulously tracked human cargo. He listed the number of enslaved people embarked, their estimated ages, physical conditions, and deaths along the way. These were not names but inventory numbers, reducing people to commodities. The logs also included calculations of losses, ration distributions, and financial valuations. This bookkeeping was essential for the business side of the slave trade. Upon arrival at a port, the captain's records would be scrutinized by traders, buyers, and insurers. They needed to know how many units of cargo had survived the voyage and what their value was. The captain's reputation and future employment often hinged on these records. Captains who lost too many enslaved people or whose ships suffered damage could face financial penalties or lose favor with merchants. Despite his isolation from daily labor and the human misery below deck, the captain could not entirely avoid confronting the brutal realities of the voyage. He sometimes had to witness or authorize punishments, face down mutinies, or make life-or-death decisions during storms. Yet, many captains maintained a cold, detached demeanor, seeing their charges primarily as profit sources rather than human beings. Some captains kept personal journals or letters, which, when preserved, offer historians insights into the mindset behind these voyages. A few reveal moments of hesitation or conflict, but the vast majority reflect a businesslike approach, concerned foremost with efficiency and survival of the ship. The captain was also responsible for communicating with owners or investors after the voyage, explaining outcomes and negotiating future trips. The captain's role was a unique blend of navigator, commander, accountant, and enforcer. He was the key figure holding together the complex, cruel machinery of the transatlantic slave trade. His decisions shaped every aspect of the voyage, determining how many survived, how the ship was managed, and ultimately, how much profit was extracted at the end. In many ways, the captain was both the mastermind and the face of the voyage's merciless reality. While crew members toiled in harsh conditions and enslaved people suffered unimaginable horrors, it was the captain who steered the ship's course, both literally and morally, through one of history's darkest chapters. Below the deck of a slave ship, where light was scarce and space even scarcer, the atmosphere was thick with despair and fear. Yet, amid this crushing darkness and suffering, there were faint, quiet sounds that escaped from the depths of human endurance. These sounds, soft, subtle, and often barely audible, were expressions of resilience, hope, and an attempt to preserve some fragment of identity and humanity in a place designed to strip them away. As night fell, the oppressive silence of the lower deck would sometimes be broken by gentle humming or low chanting. These were not just random noises but often carried deep cultural and spiritual significance. Enslaved people, many of whom came from diverse ethnic groups and traditions, used song and prayer as a way to connect with their roots and maintain a semblance of inner strength. Humming familiar tunes or softly singing hymns became a means of emotional survival, a way to remember home and resist the overwhelming isolation. Prayers, whispered in various languages, were also a common sound below deck. These prayers were cries for mercy, protection, and deliverance from suffering. Many captives turned to spiritual belief as a way to cope with their unimaginable circumstances. The darkness and silence of the ship's hold created a kind of sacred space where individuals could whisper or murmur their pleas to deities or ancestors, seeking comfort or courage to face another day. The noises were often stifled by the constant threat of punishment. Captives had to be careful. Loud singing or shouting could provoke brutal reprisals from the crew, who feared rebellion and disorder. Because of this, the sounds were usually muted, carried out in hushed tones or through body language such as swaying or tapping. Even small gestures like the rhythm of a heartbeat or a finger tapping on wood could hold meaning and foster a sense of solidarity. These quiet moments of expression also served to combat the crushing monotony and despair of life below deck. The endless darkness and sameness made time lose meaning, and the sounds of humming or prayer gave a fleeting sense of continuity and presence. They helped to break the numbing silence, reminding captives they were still alive and connected to something beyond their immediate suffering. At times, these sounds could also be heard by crew members on deck, leading to mixed reactions. Some sailors dismissed them as meaningless noise, but others recognized the deep human pain and courage behind these faint sounds. For the captives, however, these quiet rituals were often the only act of resistance possible, a spiritual defiance in the face of dehumanization. Even in their direst moments, the enslaved people below deck found ways to nurture their spirits. The sounds that drifted through the cramped, fetid air were echoes of resilience and hope, small beacons of light in an otherwise dark, oppressive journey. They remind us that even in the most brutal conditions, the human spirit struggles to survive, to remember, and to dream of freedom. The constant motion of the slave ship was an ever-present force that shaped every moment aboard the vessel. From the moment the ship left port and began its slow crawl across the vast Atlantic Ocean, the ceaseless rocking and pitching became a harsh, unrelenting companion to everyone on board. This motion was both physical and psychological, influencing the lives of the enslaved people crammed below deck, the sailors navigating the ship, and the captain directing the voyage. For the enslaved people, who were shackled in cramped, dark holds with barely enough space to move, the ship's motion was a torment in itself. The gentle sway of a boat on calm water might seem soothing to someone on solid ground, but aboard these slave ships, the endless rocking was anything but peaceful. The cramped space meant that even a small shift in the vessel's balance caused the bodies below deck to jostle against one another, causing pain and injury. People who were already weak from starvation, dehydration, and illness found their fragile bodies battered by the ship's unceasing movement. This constant motion also exacerbated seasickness. Many captives had never been on a ship before and were completely unprepared for the violent nausea and dizziness that rocked their insides. Without fresh air or space to lean against, they suffered alone in the suffocating darkness, their bodies heaving and trembling, often without anyone able to provide comfort or aid. The psychological toll was no less severe. The ship's motion became a relentless reminder of captivity, drifting over a vast and unending ocean, far from home and help. There was no escape from the sensation of being trapped on a moving prison. The shifting horizon, the endless water, and the sensation of instability fueled feelings of helplessness, fear, and disorientation. Days and nights blended together in a rhythm dictated by the ocean's waves, stripping away any sense of time or normalcy. For the crew, the ship's motion was a constant challenge to their endurance and skill. Sailors had to navigate through shifting winds and turbulent seas, adjusting sails and ropes to keep the ship on course. Their work was physically demanding and often dangerous, especially during storms when the ship could be tossed violently by towering waves. The rolling deck meant that every task, from climbing the rigging to preparing meals, required balance, agility, and careful attention. The captain's role during these times was critical. He had to judge when to change course to avoid storms or dangerous currents, monitor the ship's stability, and ensure that the crew remained vigilant. The captain also had to manage the ship's ballast and cargo distribution, balancing the weight of the enslaved people below deck with the sails and supplies above to prevent capsizing. At night, the ship's motion continued to sway and creak, disturbing any attempts at rest. Sleep was difficult for everyone aboard, interrupted by the groaning of timbers, the slap of waves against the hull, and the constant rocking. For the enslaved people, confined below deck, the motion sometimes felt like a slow dance between life and death. One wrong wave could crush bodies or cause injury in the tight, crowded hold. The ocean's rhythm was relentless. Whether calm or stormy, the ship's movement was a constant that defined the entire transatlantic journey, a cruel force that magnified the physical and mental suffering of the captives and tested the endurance and skills of the crew. It was a motion from which there was no escape, a ceaseless reminder of imprisonment and the vast, indifferent sea that lay between freedom and captivity. Despite the overwhelming confinement and misery below deck, enslaved people were sometimes granted brief moments above the ship's deck. These moments, however fleeting, were carefully controlled and few in number. The conditions in which captives were forced to live made these rare outings both a small relief and a stark reminder of their captivity. When the crew allowed enslaved people above deck, it was usually for practical reasons, primarily to clean themselves or to stretch their cramped, aching limbs. After weeks or even months of confinement in dark, airless holds, the chance to breathe fresh air, feel the sunlight, and stand upright was a brief reprieve from the relentless suffering below. But this time was always tightly regulated, often just a few minutes or hours, and never enough to restore their bodies or spirits fully. The process of bringing captives above deck was laborious and harsh. Shackled in chains, men, women, and children were led one by one or in small groups up the narrow gangways. They were still under guard by armed crew members, who were vigilant to prevent any attempts at rebellion or escape. The captives, weakened by hunger, illness, and despair, often struggled to climb the ship's steep ladders or stairs, their bodies fragile and trembling. Once on deck, the captives might be hosed down with salt water or scrubbed roughly by sailors to wash away the grime, sweat, and waste that clung to their skin. This cleaning was far from gentle. The goal was to maintain basic hygiene to prevent disease outbreaks, but it was done with little care or compassion. Still, the salt water and open air were welcome sensations after the stifling darkness below. During these brief times on deck, captives could stretch their stiffened muscles and bones, which had been cramped for so long in the tight holds. Many took the chance to move around slowly, trying to loosen joints stiffened by shackles and the lack of space. Some might try to stand in the sun's warmth, closing their eyes to feel the light on their faces, a small reminder of the world beyond the ship's prison. However, these moments were always overshadowed by the presence of armed guards and the knowledge that freedom was still far away. The captives remained shackled, under watchful eyes, and any sign of resistance or disorder was met with immediate punishment. The brief taste of fresh air was a reminder of what was lost, their homes, families, and freedom, and what lay ahead, the long, grueling voyage and the unknown fate waiting at the journey's end. For the crew, these intervals were necessary but sometimes frustrating. Maintaining the health of the enslaved people was vital for preserving their cargo, but the presence of captives on deck required extra vigilance. The risk of rebellion or escape attempts increased during these moments, and sailors were quick to react with force if needed. These fleeting opportunities on deck, though small, were among the few breaks from the suffocating conditions below. They offered captives a brief connection to the outside world, the warmth of the sun, the feel of the wind, the sight of the endless ocean, before they were forced back into the darkness and confinement of the hold. The captain's ship log or journal was one of the most crucial documents aboard a transatlantic slave ship, serving as both a record-keeping tool and a legal ledger. This log was meticulously maintained throughout the voyage and was a reflection of the cold, calculated business behind the human suffering. While the captives below deck endured unimaginable hardship, the captain's role involved tracking the cargo with detailed precision: names, ages, numbers of deaths, and ultimately, the monetary value assigned to each enslaved person. At the start of the voyage, as captives were brought aboard and forced below decks, the captain or an appointed clerk would note down each individual, often including their approximate age, physical condition, and sometimes their place of origin if known. This was important for the ship's owners and traders who treated these human beings strictly as commodities. The captives' health and appearance directly influenced their market value, so the captain's log was an essential document for calculating potential profits. Throughout the journey, the captain recorded deaths in the log with a stark, businesslike detachment. The transatlantic voyage was deadly. Many captives perished due to disease, malnutrition, mistreatment, or despair. Each death was noted carefully, often with a date, a brief cause if it could be determined, and a tally that tracked how many lives had been lost since departure. These numbers were critical for the ship's owners because fewer survivors meant less profit, and thus captains were pressured to keep mortality rates as low as possible, despite the horrific conditions. Beyond counting individuals, the captain's journal often recorded other important information such as the ship's daily position, weather conditions, course changes, and events like storms, rebellions, or illnesses. These details were part of navigation and management, but they also formed a narrative that the captain might present to ship owners or investors to justify decisions or losses. The value of the enslaved people was calculated based on their numbers and condition upon arrival. The captain's log became a financial document that could be referenced in the sale process when the ship docked in the Americas or Caribbean. Buyers would scrutinize the ship's records, comparing the cargo list with the living captives presented for sale, sometimes disputing prices or claiming compensation for deaths. The accuracy and detail of the captain's journal thus had real monetary consequences. In addition to the captives, the log kept track of the ship's crew, supplies, and other cargo items. This was necessary for managing provisions and planning the return voyage, but the focus remained heavily on the enslaved people who represented the voyage's primary, tragic purpose. For historians today, surviving captains' logs provide chilling insight into the brutal economics of the slave trade. These records reveal how enslaved people were reduced to numbers and dollar signs, their individual lives and suffering erased by cold, transactional language. The logs stand as testament to the cruel efficiency of the transatlantic slave system, where human beings were meticulously counted, bought, sold, and discarded like goods. The voyage across the Atlantic was not only a horrific human ordeal but also a perilous journey through unpredictable and often violent weather. Storms were a constant threat, capable of turning the already unbearable conditions on board into chaos and terror. When rough weather struck, the small wooden ships carrying enslaved people became battlegrounds against the fury of nature, with devastating consequences for everyone aboard. As dark clouds gathered and winds howled, the crew scrambled to prepare the ship. Sails were reefed or furled to prevent tearing, ropes tightened, and the vessel was steered to minimize the impact of crashing waves. Below decks, where the enslaved were confined, the storm's rage was felt in every creak of the timbers and every violent pitch and roll of the ship's body. The narrow, cramped holds offered no protection from the deafening noise of wind and rain, nor from the terrifying sway that tossed bodies like rag dolls in the tight spaces. Flooding was a common and frightening problem during storms. Water splashed over the deck and sometimes leaked into the lower compartments where the captives were chained. Even a small amount of seawater mixing with the human waste already saturating the hold could turn the air into a choking, disease-ridden miasma. Any flooding also threatened the structural integrity of the ship, as water could weaken the wooden hull or damage vital supplies. Crew members worked frantically to pump out water, but the sheer force of the sea often overwhelmed their efforts. Injuries were widespread during these storms. Enslaved people, already weak from starvation and illness, were thrown about by the ship's movement, sometimes colliding with the walls, the chains, or other captives. Bruises, broken bones, and crushed limbs were common. Crew members also suffered injuries as they struggled to secure the ship, climb rigging, and handle heavy equipment in the treacherous weather. The psychological impact of storms on everyone aboard was immense. For the enslaved, trapped in darkness and unable to see the sky or horizon, the roar of thunder, the crashing of waves, and the violent jerking of the ship must have been terrifying beyond words. Many prayed quietly or wept, while others might have cried out in fear or pain, their voices lost in the storm's fury. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, as no one could stop the forces battering the vessel. For the crew, storms were both a physical danger and a test of skill and endurance. The captain and officers coordinated efforts to keep the ship afloat, issuing orders and directing crew members as they risked their lives aloft in the rigging or below decks trying to secure cargo and passengers. The fear of losing the ship and its human cargo, both enslaved people and crew, was ever present, but so was the necessity to maintain discipline and control, no matter how dangerous the conditions. Storms could prolong the voyage by forcing the ship off course or damaging the sails and rigging, leading to shortages of food and water that worsened the suffering below. Delays meant captives endured even longer periods in the hellish conditions, with higher risks of disease and death. When a storm finally passed, the damage was assessed, and recovery efforts began. The ship might have lost parts of its rigging, suffered leaks, or have injured men among crew and captives. The atmosphere on board was heavy with exhaustion and dread, as the voyage still stretched ahead, with many more unknown dangers to come. Storms were a brutal reminder of the fragility of life at sea during the transatlantic slave trade. They added another layer of horror to an already horrific journey, testing the limits of endurance and hope for all those trapped on board. Death was an ever-present shadow on the transatlantic slave ships. The horrific conditions below deck, unbearable overcrowding, rampant disease, poor nutrition, and brutal treatment, meant that many enslaved people did not survive the journey. When a person died, their passing was met not with mourning or respect, but with grim indifference and harsh practicality. The deceased were simply part of the grim cargo losses, and their bodies were disposed of quickly to maintain the health and stability of the ship. Sea burials were conducted with a cold, mechanical efficiency, devoid of ceremony or compassion. The dead were carried out on stretchers or dragged by crew members to the side of the ship, often covered with a rough cloth if any covering was provided at all. One by one, bodies were lowered or thrown directly into the vast ocean below, disappearing into the depths without a trace. There was no ritual, no last rites, and no acknowledgement of the lives lost. This practice served several purposes. From a practical standpoint, leaving the bodies on board would have increased the risk of disease spreading among the living. The smell of decay in the cramped holds was already unbearable, and decomposing bodies would have exacerbated the filth and sickness. Removing the dead was essential for the survival of the remaining captives and crew, even if it was done without humanity. From a financial and dehumanizing perspective, each death was a loss to the ship's owners, but one that had to be managed coldly. The captain's log would record the death and adjust the cargo count, reducing the ship's inventory and expected profits. Yet, for the captives, the loss was a human tragedy, often involving loved ones and families torn apart. The tossing of bodies overboard was witnessed by the remaining captives, adding to the psychological torment. They would see their companions disappear into the dark waves, never to be buried in the land of their birth or given any respect. This act was a constant reminder of mortality and the brutal nature of their captivity. Reports from some slave ship survivors and crew reveal the occasional presence of sharks circling the ship during these times, attracted by the scent of blood and death. The presence of sharks was a terrifying symbol of the constant danger and despair on the voyage. Some sailors believed that the sharks were drawn by the dead bodies thrown overboard, adding to the ominous atmosphere around the ship. For those still alive below decks, the knowledge that death was all around them, and that their fellow captives were being discarded into the sea, deepened the sense of isolation and hopelessness. Yet even amidst this despair, stories of quiet resilience, whispered prayers, and moments of solidarity occasionally emerged, testifying to the indomitable spirit of those who endured. The sea burials, devoid of respect or recognition, stand as a stark emblem of the dehumanization intrinsic to the transatlantic slave trade. They mark not only the physical loss of life but also the erasure of identity, memory, and dignity of countless souls lost to the ocean's depths. Life for the crew aboard a transatlantic slave ship was harsh, demanding, and relentless, though far less brutal than that of the enslaved below deck. Every day, sailors had a strict set of responsibilities critical to the survival of the ship and the success of the voyage. These tasks required physical strength, skill, and endurance, and they had to be carried out regardless of weather conditions or the overall misery aboard. One of the primary duties of the crew was managing the sails. Adjusting sails was crucial to controlling the ship's speed and direction. Sailors had to climb the rigging, sometimes high above the deck and often in dangerous weather, to unfurl, reef, or furl sails as needed. This work was physically exhausting and perilous, especially during storms or rough seas. The slightest mistake could mean injury or death from a fall. Maintaining the ship itself was another constant task. Wooden ships required regular upkeep to stay seaworthy. Crew members repaired damaged planks, sealed leaks, and cleared the decks of debris. The salt water and constant movement made wear and tear inevitable. If repairs were not done promptly and thoroughly, the ship risked becoming unmanageable or sinking. Cleaning the ship was vital not only for maintenance but also for preventing disease. Sailors scrubbed the decks and other areas to reduce the buildup of dirt, salt, and waste. However, the hold where enslaved people were kept was notoriously difficult to keep clean, and despite their efforts, the stench and filth often overwhelmed them. Managing supplies was another essential responsibility. This included rationing food and water for the crew and enslaved captives, keeping track of provisions, and making sure everything was stored properly to avoid spoilage. The limited supplies had to last for weeks or even months, depending on the length of the voyage, so careful management was critical. Sailors also operated the pumps to remove water that entered the ship during storms or from leaks. This was back-breaking work that had to be done regularly to prevent flooding and keep the ship afloat. The crew had to monitor and control the enslaved people, often standing guard to prevent rebellions or escapes. They enforced the captain's orders and maintained order through intimidation and violence when necessary. Some sailors were involved directly in shackling or feeding the captives, making their role in the cruel system unavoidable. Despite these heavy responsibilities, the crew lived in cramped quarters with minimal comfort. They shared limited space on the ship, faced the constant threat of disease, injury, or mutiny, and endured the same monotonous days at sea. Sleep was often in short supply, and rest was fitful due to the ship's motion and the noise from both crew and captives. While the sailors' work was vital for the voyage's progress, it came with no guarantee of safety or reward beyond their wages. Many faced harsh discipline themselves, with punishments for disobedience or failure. The crew was a mix of hardened seamen, forced conscripts, and sometimes even criminals pressed into service. Their daily routines, though harsh, were methodical and disciplined, reflecting the strict hierarchy and order needed to manage a vessel in such difficult and dangerous circumstances. The survival of the ship, and the financial interests tied to the human cargo, depended on the sailors' ability to perform their roles effectively, no matter the cost. Throughout many transatlantic voyages, sailors and enslaved people alike noted the ominous presence of sharks circling the slave ships, especially during the darkest and most dreadful parts of the journey. These sharks, often seen prowling the waters near the hull, became an eerie and constant reminder of the grim reality below deck, the countless bodies that were cast into the ocean. The brutal practice of throwing deceased enslaved people overboard was a grim necessity, but it inadvertently attracted these large predators. The blood and human remains in the water created a feeding frenzy, drawing sharks close to the ships. Sailors reported that sharks would linger for hours or even days, following the ship as it sailed through the Atlantic, sometimes seen in alarming numbers. For the captives trapped below decks, the sight or even the knowledge of sharks circling above must have been terrifying. Many had no idea what awaited them once they were thrown into the sea, and the presence of these predators added another layer of fear to an already unbearable ordeal. The sharks were silent, relentless witnesses to the suffering on board, and a terrifying symbol of the fate that awaited many. Crew members often viewed the sharks with a mix of fear and practical concern. While they recognized the danger sharks posed, particularly if someone fell overboard, they also saw the sharks as natural cleaners of the ocean, disposing of the dead bodies that could otherwise cause disease and contamination on the ship. However, this pragmatic view did little to ease the tension or fear that the circling sharks instilled. Some historical accounts even describe how sharks occasionally breached the surface near the ship, their dorsal fins cutting through the water like knives, sending shivers down the spines of those on board. The presence of sharks became so intertwined with the voyage experience that they are frequently mentioned in slave ship logs and sailors' journals, often in conjunction with the grim work of managing death and disposal of bodies. Beyond the immediate physical threat, the sharks contributed to the psychological torment of the enslaved people. Knowing that the ocean, so vast and indifferent, was filled with such dangers made the journey even more harrowing. It reinforced the sense of helplessness and the knowledge that many who died would vanish into the sea, swallowed by both water and predator, with no hope for remembrance or dignity. The image of sharks following slave ships remains one of the haunting symbols of the transatlantic slave trade, a stark reminder of the cruelty, loss, and death that defined this dark chapter in history. These silent predators were part of the ecosystem of suffering, natural creatures drawn into human horrors, forced into a grim role that echoed the deep inhumanity of the voyages themselves. Despite the overwhelming cruelty and impossible conditions aboard slave ships, acts of resistance and rebellion were persistent, though perilous, part of the transatlantic journey. Enslaved people, even in the face of chains, brutal confinement, starvation, disease, and despair, found ways to assert their humanity and fight back against their captors. These acts of resistance, though often met with brutal and immediate punishment, highlight the unbreakable spirit and courage of those who endured the Middle Passage. Rebellion could take many forms, ranging from subtle acts of defiance to open revolts. Some enslaved people refused to eat, risking starvation rather than submit to the degrading conditions. Others feigned illness or injury to slow down the process of forced labor or punishment. Some spoke in their native languages to communicate secretly, sharing stories, plans, and hopes for freedom despite the oppressive environment. These small acts helped maintain a sense of identity and community amid the dehumanizing experience. More direct resistance included attempts to escape from below deck, though this was almost always futile due to the ship's design and the constant watch of the crew. Some captives tried to break their chains or sabotage the ship's equipment when opportunities arose. Others engaged in physical confrontations with the crew during moments of vulnerability, such as when captives were brought on deck or during times of disorder on the ship. Organized revolts were the most dramatic and dangerous form of resistance. Such uprisings involved groups of enslaved people coordinating to seize control of the ship, often using makeshift weapons or sheer force of numbers. These rebellions were difficult to execute given the cramped quarters, close surveillance, and the crew's readiness to respond with lethal violence. When revolts did occur, they were usually quickly suppressed, with severe consequences for all involved. Punishments for resistance were swift and merciless. Those suspected of plotting or participating in rebellion faced whipping, shackling, starvation, or even death. The captain and crew used these punishments as warnings to others, attempting to crush any spirit of defiance before it could spread. Sometimes entire groups of captives were punished collectively to discourage further resistance. The violence was intended not only to control the captives but to maintain the profit-driven order aboard the ship. Despite the risks, resistance persisted throughout the transatlantic slave trade. Stories of courage and defiance traveled among captives, passed down in whispered songs, prayers, and oral histories. These acts of rebellion were a powerful reminder that, even in the darkest moments of captivity, enslaved people fought to retain their dignity, autonomy, and hope for freedom. The legacy of resistance aboard slave ships continues to resonate today. It reminds us that those who were enslaved were not passive victims but active agents in their own struggle, who resisted oppression in whatever ways they could. Their bravery is a testament to the human spirit's resilience and the enduring quest for justice and liberty. After weeks, sometimes months, adrift in the vast and relentless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the sighting of land was an intense and complex moment for everyone aboard the slave ship. For the enslaved people trapped below deck, who had endured unimaginable suffering, the appearance of distant shores was both a glimmer of hope and a harbinger of new horrors yet to come. For the crew, it signified the end of one grueling phase of their journey and the beginning of the next, where the human cargo would be sold and the profits counted. As the ship neared the coast, the sailors would stand watch from the masts and rigging, eyes scanning the horizon for the first signs of land. The endless blue of the ocean gave way gradually to the shapes of shorelines, rocky cliffs, mangrove swamps, or bustling port cities depending on the destination. For the captives below, often confined in darkness with little knowledge of the passage of time, the captain might order them briefly brought on deck. This brief exposure to sunlight, fresh air, and open space was rare and bittersweet. Many would see the sky, the wind, and the sea for the first time in weeks or months. However, the land's arrival did not mean freedom or relief. Instead, it marked the transition from one form of captivity to another. The ships would dock at ports along the West African coast, the Caribbean islands, or the Americas. Places where enslaved people were sold at auction, separated from family, and sent to forced labor on plantations, mines, or households. For many, this was the beginning of a new, brutal chapter of enslavement far from the ocean. The anticipation of land stirred a mix of emotions: fear, dread, exhaustion, and sometimes a faint hope for eventual escape or liberation. The captives had no certainty of their fate, and many dreaded the loss of any connection to their past lives. The final hours before arrival were often filled with anxious silence, prayers, or quiet songs of resilience. For the crew, seeing land was a relief after months at sea with the constant challenges of maintaining the ship and managing the human cargo. The captain prepared to oversee the disembarkation process, while the crew readied themselves to unload supplies and handle the new responsibilities awaiting them on shore. The anticipation of profit from selling enslaved people drove their actions and attitudes, often cold and detached from the human suffering they had witnessed. The moment land appeared was a significant psychological milestone. For the enslaved, it meant the Atlantic crossing, the Middle Passage, was ending, but it was only the beginning of a lifetime of bondage. For the crew and traders, it meant the completion of a voyage that was a cog in the larger machinery of the transatlantic slave trade, an economic system built on immense cruelty and exploitation. As the ship approached the docks and anchored in the harbor, the bustling activity of ports came into view: other ships, traders, auction houses, warehouses, and the growing crowds of buyers and sellers. The captives would soon be paraded, inspected, and sold, their fates decided in merciless transactions that reduced human lives to mere property. This sighting of land, though filled with profound significance, carried with it a weight of sorrow and injustice. It marked the closing of a horrific chapter at sea and the start of countless others on foreign shores. The memory of those long weeks at sea and the transition to a new, harsh reality would haunt many for the rest of their lives, though few records survive to tell their full stories. The moment of disembarkation was one of the most harrowing and dehumanizing phases of the entire transatlantic slave voyage. After enduring weeks or months trapped below decks, subjected to unspeakable suffering, the enslaved people were forced off the ship and thrust into a new reality, one dictated by the cold, profit-driven machinery of the slave trade. Upon arrival at the port, the enslaved were brought up from the dark, cramped holds in chains, often weak, sick, and barely able to stand. They were paraded on the docks or in auction yards, where traders, plantation owners, and other buyers inspected them like livestock. Their bodies were examined for signs of health, strength, and value. This process was humiliating and painful, stripping away any remaining dignity and reinforcing their status as mere commodities. Those deemed fit for sale were lined up or displayed in pens, sometimes branded or marked for identification, awaiting their fate. Families were torn apart, parents separated from children, husbands from wives, without regard for bonds or emotions. The cries, pleas, and resistance of the enslaved were often met with violence, beatings, or forceful coercion to maintain order. After the auctions, the enslaved were sent to various destinations. Many were transported to plantations, mines, or households across the Americas and the Caribbean, where they would face brutal labor, harsh punishment, and a life stripped of freedom. Others were kept in holding facilities temporarily, awaiting shipment further inland or to other colonies. Disembarkation was also a physically exhausting process. The captives, already weakened by starvation, disease, and maltreatment, were forced to walk long distances, often under heavy guard, to their new places of confinement or labor. The transition from the ship's hold to land was marked by a cruel shift, from one form of imprisonment to another, often more prolonged and brutal. For the crew and traders, this stage represented the culmination of their grim business. The sale of enslaved people was where profits were realized, investments recouped, and preparations made for future voyages. The human suffering was disregarded in favor of financial gain, with captains and merchants calculating returns based on numbers, weights, and market demand. The disembarkation process was frequently accompanied by the clearing and resetting of the ship for the next journey. The ship would be scrubbed, repaired, and stocked with goods such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, or rum, products cultivated through the forced labor of enslaved people. These commodities would be transported back to Europe, completing the triangular trade cycle. While the enslaved were sold and sent off to their fates, the lasting impact of disembarkation echoed through generations. Families shattered, cultures displaced, and lives forever altered. The port scenes were the starting point for centuries of resistance, survival, and eventual struggles for freedom and equality. The unloading and selling of human beings marked the physical and psychological breaking point of the Middle Passage. It was a moment where hope was challenged by the stark realities of enslavement, but also where the spirit of those who survived began, in many cases, the long fight for dignity, identity, and liberation. Once the enslaved people had been taken off the ship and sold, the vessel itself became the next focus of attention. The ship needed to be cleaned, repaired, and prepared for its return voyage or next journey. Tasks essential not only for maintaining the ship's seaworthiness but also for the health and safety of the crew and future cargo. The process of cleaning the ship was grueling and unpleasant. The hold, where enslaved people had been confined in filthy, overcrowded conditions, was a cesspool of human waste, vomit, blood, and decay. The stench was overwhelming, a lingering reminder of the horror that had taken place within the ship's wooden walls. To scrub away this filth, crew members used harsh brushes and buckets of seawater mixed with vinegar or other disinfectants if available. The aim was to remove as much contamination as possible to prevent the spread of disease among the crew and to make the space usable again. Disinfection was crucial because the ships were breeding grounds for sickness. Diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, scurvy, and respiratory infections thrived in the damp, dark, and cramped holds. Without thorough cleaning, any future cargo, whether human or goods, was at great risk. However, the cleaning was often rushed and imperfect, with many areas inaccessible or neglected due to the ship's cramped structure. Beyond the hold, the entire ship was inspected and maintained. Sailors repaired sails, checked rigging, and sealed any leaks. Wooden planks were replaced if rotten or damaged by sea worms or rot. The deck was scrubbed clean of salt and grime to prevent deterioration and slipping hazards. Supplies were restocked, including fresh water, food provisions for the crew, and trade goods meant for the next leg of the journey. The ship's guns and weapons were cleaned and checked in case of resistance or piracy on the return voyage. The captain and officers oversaw this process meticulously, understanding that a well-maintained ship was vital for survival on the often dangerous sea. Still, the urgency to begin the return journey or start a new voyage often led to shortcuts, increasing risks for the crew and the ship. This cleanup also symbolized a kind of erasure, a deliberate attempt to wipe away visible evidence of the suffering endured during the Middle Passage. By scrubbing and disinfecting, the ship was reset as a vessel of commerce, ready to carry goods instead of people. Yet the invisible scars, the memories and trauma of those who had suffered and died, remained embedded in its timbers. After the cleaning and repairs, the ship was often docked for a time to await its next mission. Whether it was to sail back to Europe with sugar, tobacco, and cotton, or to head once more to Africa to capture more human cargo, the ship's dark history would repeat itself. Though the physical dirt was washed away, the ship itself was a grim reminder of the brutal transatlantic slave trade, an instrument of immense cruelty and exploitation, perpetuated through cycles of violence and commerce. The cleanup was but a momentary pause in a continuing cycle of human suffering. After the enslaved people were disembarked and sold, the business side of the transatlantic slave trade took center stage. Traders, shipowners, and captains turned their attention to the financial records, meticulously calculating the profits from the voyage. This process was cold, precise, and driven entirely by economics, with human lives reduced to numbers on ledgers and balance sheets. The ship's captain and the merchants ashore compiled detailed inventories listing the number of enslaved people sold, their ages, genders, health status, and any damages that might affect their market value. Each person was assigned a price based on these factors, with strong, young adults fetching higher sums, while the elderly, children, or those who had fallen ill often sold for less, or were sometimes discarded altogether if deemed unsellable. Alongside these figures, the traders accounted for the losses incurred during the voyage, those who had died at sea due to disease, malnutrition, or mistreatment. These deaths were factored into the final calculations, often listed as cargo lost, a stark and brutal term that highlighted the commodification of human beings. Expenses were tallied as well. This included the cost of purchasing enslaved people along the African coast, provisions for the crew, ship maintenance, taxes or tariffs levied at ports, bribes to officials, and the wages of sailors. The overall profit was the difference between the total revenue from selling enslaved people and the voyage's expenses. Shipowners often sought to maximize profits through various means, squeezing more people aboard the ship to increase cargo, cutting costs on food and supplies, or extending the voyage to deliver enslaved people to the highest-paying markets. These decisions, driven by greed, often resulted in even worse conditions and higher mortality rates for the captives. The financial records were kept with great care because slave voyages were high-risk investments. Losses could wipe out fortunes, but successful voyages generated enormous wealth for merchants, shipowners, and investors. The trade was part of a global economic system that fueled the growth of European economies, built colonial plantations, and shaped the world's emerging capitalist markets. Sometimes, captains kept personal journals or logs that included financial notes alongside accounts of the journey's hardships, illnesses, and deaths. These documents provide historians with grim insights into how deeply intertwined commerce and human suffering were during the slave trade. Profit calculation also played a role in planning future voyages. Investors used past data to decide where to send ships, how many enslaved people to transport, and which goods to bring back on the return trip. The cycle of capturing, selling, and exploiting human lives was repeated over and over, each iteration turning greater sums of money at the expense of millions of lives. The financial aspect of the slave trade starkly contrasts with the human cost, highlighting the cruel economics that powered one of history's darkest chapters. Behind every profit figure was a story of pain, loss, and shattered families, stories often ignored or erased in pursuit of wealth. Following the sale of enslaved people in the Americas, the slave ships did not simply return empty. Instead, they embarked on the return voyage to Europe laden with goods produced by the very labor of those they had just sold. Commodities like sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, and sometimes even precious metals. This leg of the journey was an integral part of what became known as the triangular trade, connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a brutal cycle of exploitation and profit. The return voyage marked a shift in the ship's cargo from human beings to valuable raw materials, but conditions aboard remained far from comfortable. The hold, once cramped with human lives, was now packed with barrels of sugar, bales of cotton, and crates filled with tobacco leaves, goods grown on plantations by enslaved laborers whose suffering was an invisible but essential part of the entire process. Sailors and crew faced their own challenges on the homeward journey. The ship's heavy cargo altered its balance and sailing characteristics, sometimes making the vessel harder to maneuver. The crew still needed to keep a sharp watch for storms, piracy, and other hazards on the open ocean. The constant work of adjusting sails, maintaining the rigging, and navigating continued relentlessly. Despite the changing cargo, the ship's return trip was no less dangerous or arduous. The vessel still sailed across vast stretches of ocean, contending with unpredictable weather, rough seas, and the ever-present risk of illness or injury among the crew. Fresh provisions were crucial but often limited, and water supplies were carefully rationed to last the journey. Economically, the return voyage completed the cycle of the triangular trade. European merchants eagerly awaited the arrival of these goods, which were processed, sold, and consumed in markets across Europe. The wealth generated fueled industrial growth and further investments in slave ships and colonial enterprises, embedding the slave trade deep into the fabric of global commerce. On board, there was a grim irony. While the human cargo had been forced into unimaginable suffering, the goods now carried symbolized the fruits of that suffering, the profits made from unpaid labor and exploitation. The ships themselves were vessels of violence, commerce, and cruelty, linking continents in a tragic chain of dependency. As the ship neared European shores, preparations began for unloading the goods. Dock workers, merchants, and investors anticipated the arrival with keen interest, knowing that the next phase of this mercantile system was about to begin. The arrival signaled the end of a brutal journey for the ship and its crew, but the cycle of commerce and suffering was far from over. Upon docking, the goods were swiftly unloaded, sold, and distributed throughout European markets. This influx of products like sugar and tobacco transformed everyday life for many Europeans but came at a staggering human cost, hidden from the buyers and consumers who enjoyed the final products. The return voyage was thus not merely a journey home but a crucial link in a system built on the forced movement and suffering of millions, illustrating how the transatlantic slave trade operated as a global network, connecting human lives and economies across vast distances. Once the ship had returned to port and unloaded its cargo, the grim cycle was set to begin anew. Preparation for the next voyage was swift and systematic, fueled by the relentless demand for enslaved labor and the profits it promised. Shipowners, merchants, and captains worked together to ready the vessel for another journey, another chapter in the transatlantic slave trade that would bring more human lives into unimaginable suffering. The first step was thorough inspection and repair of the ship itself. The wooden hull was checked for damage caused by storms, the wear of constant sailing, and the corrosive saltwater. Any leaks or weakened planks had to be fixed to ensure the vessel could survive the long, treacherous crossing again. The rigging and sails were mended or replaced to keep the ship swift and maneuverable, essential for both evading storms and pirates, and for maximizing speed to protect the cargo. Next, the ship was scrubbed and disinfected as best as possible. The lingering stench of the previous voyage, the mixture of sweat, waste, sickness, and death, was scrubbed from every surface, though such efforts could never fully erase the memory or physical marks left behind. This cleaning was both practical and psychological, intended to prepare for a new group of captives and to avoid spreading disease, at least as much as the era's knowledge allowed. The crew was either replenished or rotated. New sailors were recruited or hired, often men accustomed to the hard, dangerous life at sea but who were also complicit in the system. These sailors prepared for months away from home, enduring harsh discipline and grueling labor, their lives tied to the fate of the ship and its human cargo. Provisions were restocked, food for the crew, water supplies, and equipment needed for the voyage. These were often minimal and designed to last the expected duration, though the unpredictability of the sea could extend or shorten the journey unexpectedly. Every ration had to be carefully planned because spoilage and shortages could quickly turn disastrous. At the same time, the shipowners and traders arranged contracts and agreements for purchasing enslaved people on the African coast. Agents and middlemen in Africa played a critical role in supplying captives, often captured in raids, wars, or kidnappings. These agreements could involve exchanges of goods such as textiles, firearms, alcohol, and other items highly sought after in African markets. This exchange system, deeply entwined with local conflicts and economies, facilitated the steady supply of captives for the ships. The ship's captain and officers reviewed their logs and plans, plotting routes to African ports where the human cargo would be gathered. They strategized how to maximize efficiency and profit while minimizing losses due to disease, rebellion, or shipwreck. Slave ships often followed specific, brutal patterns designed to exploit both people and resources at every stage. Finally, the ship was loaded with trade goods intended for exchange in Africa: guns, metal tools, cloth, beads, and other manufactured items that European traders believed would secure them captives. These goods were carefully stowed below decks or in the hold, ready to be bartered or traded for human lives. The process was cold, efficient, and deeply dehumanizing, stripping away any thought of the suffering that would come next. The ship, once again ready, stood poised to sail out on a voyage marked by cruelty and pain, continuing the cycle of capture, transport, and exploitation. This preparation phase highlights the relentless economic drive behind the transatlantic slave trade, a business that saw human beings as mere cargo, interchangeable and replaceable, fueling a global system built on oppression and profit. For centuries, the brutal reality of life aboard slave ships and the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade remained shrouded in silence and omission, both in public discourse and private memory. Despite the sheer scale and frequency of these voyages, millions of lives forcibly uprooted, transported, and sold, there was a long-term societal reluctance to confront or openly acknowledge these events. This silence wasn't accidental, it was often deliberate, shaped by the powerful interests that benefited from slavery and by cultural, political, and psychological factors that made facing this dark chapter deeply uncomfortable. In the immediate aftermath of the abolition of the slave trade and slavery itself in many countries, the focus in historical narratives tended to shift away from the day-to-day horrors of the Middle Passage. Instead, histories often emphasized the economic development that slavery had fueled, or portrayed abolition as a triumphant moral victory. The lived experiences of those who had suffered aboard the ships, the capture, the torment below decks, the loss of family and identity, were marginalized or left out entirely. Within families and communities descended from enslaved people, stories of the voyages were sometimes passed down, but often in fragmented or coded ways. The trauma was so immense that many chose silence as a means of survival. The unspeakable suffering and the shame imposed by a society that treated them as property made it difficult to openly discuss these memories. This silence was a protective veil, a way to shield descendants from pain but also a barrier to full understanding and healing. Academic scholarship on the slave trade, especially in the early centuries after abolition, often relied heavily on documents created by traders, captains, and colonial administrators, whose records reduced human lives to numbers and cargo descriptions. These perspectives further obscured the human suffering at the core of these voyages. It wasn't until more recent generations of historians, anthropologists, and descendants of enslaved people began to recover oral histories, personal narratives, and new archival evidence that the true scale and horror of the Middle Passage started to be fully understood and taught. The silence was also maintained by broader societal reluctance to confront systemic racism and the enduring legacies of slavery. In many nations, particularly those that benefited economically from the slave trade, acknowledging this history challenged national myths and required grappling with uncomfortable truths about inequality, exploitation, and injustice that continue to affect societies today. Only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has there been a more open, widespread effort to break the silence. Memorials, museums, literature, and education programs now increasingly confront the realities of the Middle Passage, honoring the resilience and humanity of those who suffered. Public acknowledgement and remembrance are seen as crucial steps in addressing the long-lasting impact of slavery and its central role in shaping the modern world. Yet, the long-term silence about the slave voyages reminds us of how history can be suppressed or distorted, and how vital it is to recover and share stories that have been hidden or forgotten. Remembering these voyages is not just about recounting past horrors, it is about honoring the memory of those lost, understanding the roots of systemic injustice, and ensuring that such suffering is never repeated or ignored. This video is for educational or entertainment purposes only, and information provided in the video may be incorrect. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to the channel and like the video. Good night.